For Russia, there's no end in sight in Ukraine. Russian military blogger Two Majors yesterday put out an assessment of the future outlook of the war, saying, quote, "There are no grounds for an imminent end to the war. There are still many difficult days left before achieving the declared and periodically changing goals of the special military operation, which range from complete denazification and demilitarization of the whole of Ukraine to the liberation of the territories of new regions from the armed forces of Ukraine." So a lot of the celebration recently in Russia has been around the relatively rapid advance of the Russian armed forces near Pokrovsk. It's in the southeastern portion of Ukraine. We're going to talk about some updates there as well as some other hotspots all across the map, and then wrap up today with a look at some areas where Russia is more and more concerned the Ukraine actually has something up their sleeve and is going to kick off another offensive somewhere else along the front. Now, shifting over to the map here, I'm going to be using today Deep State Map. This is going to be linked in the description below, along with another resource, Suryak Map. They both have their pros and cons. I tend to use the different maps throughout a handful of videos. I've gone back and forth at times. Today, we're going to focus on Deep State Map. Now, I'm going to start up here in the northeastern portion, talking about the Kursk operation, the Ukrainian offensive, but to kind of give you an idea of the map that we're looking at here, the blue that we're going to talk about in a second is Ukrainian-held territory inside of Russia. The green is territory taken by Russia inside of Ukraine since 2022 that has since been liberated by Ukraine. The light red here in kind of the east and the south is territory currently occupied by Russia since 2022. And the purple here in the Donbass and down in Crimea is territory occupied by Russia inside of Ukraine since 2014. Now, let's move up here to Kursk. This operation kicked off a little over a month ago at this point, and as of today, Ukraine still holds over 1,150 square kilometers of Russian territory, which I think is unexpected. It was unexpected for a lot of people. Now, Russia has surged quite a few forces into this region, a lot more than they had when this operation first kicked off. They've stood up some new commands to kind of facilitate military operations in the region, and by and large, they've stopped Ukraine in just about every direction. So we're not really seeing Ukrainian advances day in and day out at all, and we really haven't seen those since about the first week of this operation. However, we also really haven't seen Russia push Ukraine back at all, like anywhere inside of Kursk, which is kind of surprising. And this was one of the major concerns. Now, it is still early. It's just a month into this. But this was one of the major concerns that a lot of critics pushed back on this and said Ukraine is being incredibly risky. They're putting all of these forces out there, and look at this bulge inside of Russia on this map. How many of those forces could potentially get cut off and Russia could break through, and they have so many troops throughout the country? Who knows what could happen here, right? It could be a major sacrifice of Ukrainian soldiers, and for what? But again, here we sit a month later, and Russia really hasn't made hardly any progress at all in pushing Ukraine out of their territory. Now, one of the reasons that could be happening is if we move over here to the same river, kind of moving through north of Glushkovo, there have been Russian pontoon. The bridges were blown there a few weeks ago, right? So all of the bridges, the normal crossings that were established, they're gone. Russia has been establishing pontoon or temporary bridges in this area for probably 3 weeks now, and I have lost track of how many of those Ukraine has destroyed. Essentially, Ukraine is just watching this entire river, and every time a Russian pontoon bridge is either on its way to be installed or does get installed, it's like a matter of a few hours, maybe a day later, and that thing's out of commission, struck with some sort of long-range precision munition. So that's certainly impacting some of Russia's ability to fight back against Ukraine in this area, but it's not everything, right? That doesn't explain why Russia hasn't been able to, surge more troops to the north or eastern portion of this pocket the Ukraine has created. Now, by and large, a lot of the assessments looking at this Ukrainian operation are presenting it as a success, but they're being very cautious in how they say that right now because, again, it's still very, very early. Now, there was an assessment from a couple intelligence professionals just yesterday that was published in the Financial Times. The CIA director, Bill Burns, and then MI6 chief Richard Moore, which is the head of British intelligence, came together in a panel, and they actually talked about this Kursk operation. Burns said that Kursk was, quote, a significant tactical achievement that had boosted Ukrainian morale and exposed Russia's weaknesses. It had raised questions across the Russian elite about where this is all headed. There's some value in that, right? And then Richard Moore, the head of MI6 or British intelligence, said, quote, the Kursk offensive was a typically audacious and bold move by the Ukrainians to try to change the game. although he cautioned it was too early to say how long Kyiv's forces would be able to control the Russian territory they had seized. And I should mention that, on day 2 of this operation, people were saying we don't know how long Ukraine's going to be able to hold this. The thought then was as soon as Russia got their act together, they'd be pushed right out of Kursk. And again, it's been over 4 weeks. It's been over a month now, and they're still there. That doesn't mean they'll be there in another month or another 6 months, but it's getting harder and harder for Russia to push them out. It's going to require more and more Russian resources to actually clear the Ukrainians out of Kursk. Now, there was an interesting article related to kind of the impact of the Kursk operation that came out on Open Minds, which is like a data research company, if you will, and they scanned a bunch of different Russian media, and they mentioned that the pro-Russian war correspondents pushed the narrative about NATO being the main actor in preparing and even executing the Kursk operation, which shouldn't come as a big surprise to anybody who's following this. You probably saw those talking points like as soon as the border was breached. The Open Minds article said, quote, "This narrative was among the most popular ones, accounting for 14% of war correspondents' top content on this topic. They claimed that the Western powers are clearly behind the incursion, from supplying the weapons to sharing intelligence data and planning the entire operation." Now, at this point, it's pretty clear that Ukraine did not share any of this information at all with the United States, NATO, and any of their other Western partners. It seems like everybody was caught off guard, and we knew that pretty early on. It's not really a secret that they did this without kind of consulting the United States and others. We've all been kind of on our heels trying to catch up with Ukrainian planning to maintain that operational security. Yes, there are Western-provided weapons entering Kursk because most of Ukraine's military at this point is Western-provided. So that shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. But we are still today seeing this operation referred to as NATO-planned, resourced, and executed. You tend to see that from pro-Russian commentators and pro-Russian media anytime Ukraine conducts any sort of really successful operation. There tends to be kind of a view in these pro-Russian sources that Ukraine is incapable. They don't have their own agency, that they can't conduct any sort of successful operation on their own. It's not the first time we've seen a Ukrainian success labeled as something that NATO did, and I'm sure it won't be the last. Now, before diving into the second portion of the front down near Pokrovsk, where there's been some pretty significant changes in the last couple of days, I did want to give you an update on the fundraiser that we kicked off about a week ago for the medics of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. I didn't know what I was doing there. The first time doing this, didn't have a lot of expectations. You guys blew this out of the water. This was incredible. So we raised over $30,000 in less than a week for CASVAC vehicles for this medical unit in the 47th Mechanized. So we've already started sending some of that money over. They've, in fact, purchased their first vehicle. They sent over the pictures, the documentation, the receipts, all that stuff. Now, these vehicles are going to be used to move medics around the battlefield from one location to another, to get the medical personnel where they're needed at the front, at times to move casualties off the front back towards aid stations, or relocate medical supplies to different areas of the front as needed, right? So again, that money, that $30,000 going to these medics is actively saving lives on the battlefield. It's awesome. I am blown away, humbled by your all's generosity. But we're not done. There's a lot of units in the 47th Mechanized, and in chatting with some of our friends over there in one of the maneuver units, a Bradley commander, in fact, they're talking about what we all know, the constant danger that is Russian FPV drones. So we're going to work on some protective measures in a new fundraiser that I will have linked in the description below for electronic warfare of sorts. We've got some jammers picked out according to our friends in the Ukrainian military. They said this is what works. This is what they need. It's a commercially available electronic warfare jammer to prevent Russian drones from operating near their vehicles. We've got some very cheap drone detectors that gives the guys an idea of when Russian drones are overhead so they can take evasive action or hide as needed. And then they're also looking for some reconnaissance drones to kind of overwatch their maneuver elements so they don't, get into trouble out there as they're conducting operations. Now, as promised, I donated the AdSense money after I took some taxes out, unfortunately, to this campaign. And I'm not the only one, right? We got about 25% of the way there already in just a couple days. So as before, I just want to say it's an absolute honor and a privilege to do this with you guys. So let's get after it. All right, now shifting over to Pokrovsk, which has really been a major issue on the front for quite a while now. And, kind of down here in the southeastern portion of Ukraine, this has really been a hot topic. There's been more public outcry against Zelensky and General Syrsky, the head of the Ukrainian military, over what's happening in Pokrovsk than I've seen against either one of them in quite a while. However, it looks like right now they've essentially stopped, or at the very least slowed, the Russian advance. Now, to give you an idea here, I do want to play a bit of a time lapse going back to, we'll do kind of towards the end of August. Close this, and that's why I like Deep State Map, because you can see how this plays out. And what you're going to see as this moves forward is Russia's continuing, but come September, they've kind of stalled out towards this northern area here, right? So they're not necessarily moving any closer to Pokrovsk. There's some advances here in the south. Go back again to the beginning of September. So looking at the last week here, some advances to the south, maybe trying to close off this pocket, which isn't crazy, but really no more push towards Pokrovsk, which is very different than it was, over the course of the few weeks prior. You go back to the beginning of August, and you'll see that it is just kind of a constant advance, closing in any day now. So it does look like, to Ukraine's benefit, Russia has generally slowed down. Now, this kind of coincides with what appears to be at least 4 Ukrainian brigades deployed to this axis, and it happens about the same time as this slowdown. Not entirely clear, did they slow down because the 4 Ukrainian brigades arrived, or did the 4 Ukrainian brigades arrive at the same time that the Russian military kind of ran out of steam? Because that's a very real thing in war. You cannot just keep going forever at the same pace. You kind of wear down, you extend your supply lines, your troops need a break. Combat wears you down physically, mentally, and emotionally. You cannot just keep going day in and day out. It's entirely possible that if Russia wasn't rotating their troops, or if they're rotating through the same couple of units, they might have exhausted themselves to a degree and they have to stop for a period of time. Again, or we've got the 4 Ukrainian brigades there that effectively stop the Russian advance for now. Now, the reason that Pokrovsk is important, and it is very important, is that it is a logistics hub. And turn on the satellite here so you can see some of these areas. For starters, you can see all the roads. We'll start here with the rail line. So it is one of only a few rail lines in the area. You can see the rail hub here right in the middle of town, already under Russian artillery fire. And then if you zoom out a little bit using the standard map, you can see the roads and how this connects different areas of the front, right? So if Pokrovsk falls, and Russia's already taken this road here, but you can see how this would essentially shut off access to a large portion here to the east. All Ukrainian supplies then would have to come down through Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, could no longer flow here from the west, which is, the majority of aid and supplies are coming from the west. So it's a major problem. If Russia cuts this off, it essentially puts at risk this entire 60 or so kilometer of the front that would have to close down. And of course, you can see Chasiv Yar over here, also a hotspot right now we're going to get to here in a minute. So Pokrovsk is very important. And I get a little frustrated when we've seen any number of these cities and towns that are either liberated by Ukraine or they're taken by Russia. And we constantly hear, it's important, it's important, it's important. And then the minute that it falls or change hands, you hear people say, well, actually, it isn't important. It's not a strategic town. Pokrovsk is important. It is very important, and I want to make sure we say that now, and I would expect that Ukraine mounts a significant defense to try to maintain control over that. All right, so the next area I want to get into is Chasiv Yar. There's been a lot of very, very heavy fighting in Chasiv Yar for quite a while now, but in terms of changes in territorial control, nothing. In fact, over the course of the last month or so, Russia has gained about 200 meters. Right, so we're not talking about kilometers like we are in other areas. We're talking about meters, and it's not a troll. It's just how slow progress is there. So Chasiv Yar, again, starting kind of zoomed out here on the map. We're going to go into the east. We've got Pokrovsk that we're looking at here, and if we follow that road, right, the resupply route for much of this front over here, it kind of ends up over in Chasiv Yar. And you can see where Russia is pushing from the other side and kind of this pocket, essentially, that they're threatening to cut off. So the Pokrovsk axis here, and then you've got Chasiv Yar here. Both of these kind of play off of each other. Now, Chasiv Yar, there's been no advance at all. Again, 200 meters since the beginning of August. And one of the main reasons for that is there is a canal running here along the eastern side of the city. It's not quite high def enough to be able to do that, but there's a canal running right through here. It's essentially right where the lines separate Russian from Ukrainian forces. And really, Russia hasn't been able to penetrate that at all. This is something where every so often, once a week or something for the last probably 2 months, you'll occasionally hear that, hey, it looks like Russia may have breached the canal, and maybe they get a couple troops across here or there. But again, we've been hearing that for over a month now. So any breach of that canal is just a couple troops at most, and is certainly no no bridgehead for Russian forces to really advance on Chasiv Yar. Now, Chasiv Yar itself is getting absolutely hammered with Russian glide bombs. The fighting is very, very intense in Chasiv Yar, but in terms of territorial change, ground changing hands, it's just not happening there like at all. Then there's another area that's just not getting anywhere near the amount of attention as elsewhere along the front. I mean, most of the focus right now is in Kursk, understandably so, Pokrovsk, understandably so, a little bit in Chasiv Yar, Kupiansk, kind of falling under the radar. So going back to the map here, we've got, of course, Pokrovsk here, moving a little bit east. We've got Chasiv Yar just west of Bakhmut. And if we go further north, you're going to hit Kupiansk. And you can see just at a quick look why Kupiansk is important. It's a logistical hub close to the front. We've got a lot of key roads running through the city. Now, I've got the map backed out to the end of July to give you an idea of how the front has changed here. It's not massive changes, but again, with how little the lines have changed in Ukraine, I feel like this is really flying under the radar. I mean, these are fair Russian advances over the course of the last month, something that we just haven't seen in other areas hardly at all. So again, I wouldn't, put this as some strategic issue right now in Kupiansk, but it's worth keeping an eye on. Russia is making an advance there, and for whatever reason, I feel like it's just completely flying under the radar. Now, I do want to talk about some areas that Russia is apparently still concerned that Ukraine is going to launch some sort of second offensive, third offensive, whatever you want to call it. They're essentially saying that Kursk is not it. There's something else up Ukraine's sleeve, and they're just kind of waiting for that, where this next attack is going to come. There's three main areas that Russian media is kind of hammering on right now. So the first is somewhere else along the Russian-Ukrainian border. Maybe it's somewhere else in Kursk. They've specifically called out Bryansk and Belgorod, which are understandable. There's even been, in the last couple of weeks, a couple times where there'll be like probing actions along the border, and there's regularly like small-scale conflicts in Bryansk and Belgorod right along the border regions, and you'll see some sort of like light probing action, and a Russian channel or two will go off the deep end saying like, it's happening, Ukraine is mounting another incursion, we've got an armored element coming, and then it kind of dies down, and you got a bunch of people kind of jumping on him saying, dude, easy. You're out of control. Like, calm down a little bit. This is just normal activity. So there is some Russian concern for sure about something additional happening in Bryansk, elsewhere in Kursk, or Belgorod. The second area that there's been a lot of Russian concern as of late is in Zaporozhye, kind of generally down here in the southern portion of the front, which is understandable given that, again, if we're talking very generally, this large area, the front, that was kind of the general priority for last summer's counteroffensive. The argument down here is that if it was important enough for the main effort of Ukraine's summer offensive, it's probably still important, and they wouldn't just give up on it that quickly. I actually don't think we should expect much from Ukraine in Zaporozhye. There's no indications at this point that Russian troops have been pulled from this area, and we know that the minefields and the trenches that caused so much of a problem last summer, they're still there, and some of them have probably been rebuilt at this point. So the issues and the challenges around Orikhiv and some of these areas in the south towards Tokmak, they still exist and maybe are harder to get through today than they were a year ago. When you look at how Ukraine made significant progress up here in Kursk, they had a bunch of different advantages that they don't have down in Zaporozhye. So in Kursk, they surprised everyone moving into a new area, and they attacked where the defenses were light to non-existent. When you go down to Zaporozhye, it's the exact opposite of that. Russia is expecting Ukraine to advance in this area. They're heavily fortified and have a lot of battle-hardened, experienced troops there. Either way, there's still a lot of Russian chatter about the possibility of some sort of Ukrainian offensive down here in Zaporozhye. And then the last one, actually, which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, is Crimea. There is still constant Russian chatter on a handful of different Telegram channels, kind of concerned that Ukraine is going to do something to either try to take Crimea or more likely just try to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces to continue to operate there. It's a big ask, right? This is something that is very important to Ukraine, very important to Russia, but of course, given its geography, pulling something off like that, especially with ground troops, forces on the ground, is going to be very, very, very challenging. So I have no idea if there's anything else coming or where that might happen if it does take place, but thought it was worth mentioning what the Russians are worried about. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out Between the Lines, which is our national security publication, reader-funded publication, linked in the description below. We've got some audio articles, written articles, podcasts, all sorts of different topics covered. But thanks for watching. and I'll see y'all next time.